Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. When talking about the unrest that's taken place in Iraq, over the recent months, it's been more about internal issues and about the governance system there. But just over the past couple of days, we've had that unrest and those protests right at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq as well, within the Green Zone in Baghdad. Now, right in the lead up to that, of course, we had the Americans claiming that an Iranian-backed militia had attacked one of their bases. An American contractor was killed, and so the Americans then attacked, in revenge, seemingly, and killed 25 members of Kataib Hezbollah. Many people would talk about this as then a new proxy war, possibly, being played out on Iraqi land between the United States and Iran. Is that true? And that's a question I'll put now to our guests who are joining us now. We're joined now by Farhang Jahanpour, who is a part-time tutor at the Department of Continuing Education at Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. He's joining us now from London. Also joining us now from New York is Vincent Vernuccio, who is president of the American Analysis of News and Media Incorporated. He's served in an executive capacity both in Democrat and Republican administrations at the state and local levels. Frank and Farhang, thank you both for your time today. Frank, let me start with you. Give us what you think may be the American point of view here. I mean, the Americans have spoken about, listen, an American contractor was killed, we had to respond. And that what's happened at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq is Iran's fault. Is that a fair reading?
The Trump administration believes that the Iranians have been using proxies pretty much throughout the planet to engage in what the Trump administration calls terrorism, also interference in the internal affairs of other nations, particularly and most closely, of course, Iraq. This is not new. Iranian-Iraqi relations have been devastatingly bad going back decades. So it is a valid point of view from the perspective of the United States.
Farhang, I wonder what you think of that, because people would then argue, Farhang, on the other hand, listen, the system put in place within Iraq right now was actually put in by the United States. So it's U.S. involvement, many would say, which is actually the problem.
This question of proxies I find very objectionable because practically all regimes, countries in the Middle East are being supported by one or the other power. For example, America supports Israel very, very heavily. So there's Saudi Arabia and UAE. One can't call Israeli forces U.S. proxy forces in the region and so on. The fact is, as you know, and as everybody knows, there have been massive demonstrations from Hong Kong to the Middle East, to India, to Iran, to Iraq, to Lebanon, and of course practically in all the Latin American countries and also inside Europe, in France and United States itself. The US administration tends to have a very selective approach towards these. Some of them they totally ignore, some of them they fan the flames of protest, and some of them, in the case of Iraq, suddenly they become the friends of the Iraqis and they call those Iran proxy forces. I really don't buy it.
But then, Farhang, if we're fair for a moment, attacking a diplomatic mission of the United States in the fashion that it was attacked, be it with stones and otherwise, and its outside facade was also, I believe, quite damaged. Is that the way to go about showing anger? And do you actually think that Iran was even really involved in that, as is alleged?
That is assuming that it actually took place. Iraqi prime minister is the authority on the subject. And he said the issue was under investigation. He called on the Americans not to carry out those aggressive attacks. He said they are against Iraqi sovereignty. But of course, the Americans went ahead and did it anyway. Yeah. So they are the judge, jury, and executioner at the same time. They decide who has done it, what they should do, and they carry out in a very disproportionate manner, as we have seen in recent days.
Frank, I wonder what your thoughts about U.S. involvement in Iraq overall, because many people would say that the kind of resentment, even before this entire situation with this American contractor being killed even came up on the streets, even at Tahrir Square and other places throughout Iraq, there was criticism of both sides, both Iran and the United States. So just for a moment, if we can concentrate on the U.S., do you think that the U.S. role in Iraq has also been unhelpful and that there's room for Iraqis to be resentful of it?
If we look at the conclusion of the last war, which eliminated Saddam Hussein, we saw a potential for the people of Iraq to engage in a democratic government, perhaps for the first time in decades. You remember those wonderful pictures of Iraqi citizens holding up a purple thumb, indicating that they have voted, very proudly doing so. The point that was made about the U.S. involvement in other places, or lack of involvement, perhaps in other places such as Hong Kong, certainly misses the point that in Hong Kong, those are pro-freedom demonstrators. Nor is there anyone in Hong Kong or any of those other places mentioned threatening the United States and other countries in the area. Indications are clear that Iran has delivered substantial amounts of weaponry to its backers in the region, including very serious weaponry such as missiles, which are currently being fired into Israel. Therefore, I think if you look at the United States' role, it's one that is consistent with its essential basis of promoting free elections. Now, to deny that this demonstration took place, indeed, even as the three of us are looking at the telecast of the demonstrations themselves, seems to be not a denial of the United States' point, but a denial of reality itself.
But then, Frank, if we're completely honest with each other, I mean, if you wear the shoe on the other foot for a moment and just see how the Iranians would view the situation, they would have the exact opposite argument as you've just put it, right? Do you not think that the reality is probably somewhere in the middle, that the American role is not as noble as all of us may be taught to believe? I
believe the British Prime Minister Disraeli once said that nations don't have principles, they have interest, or don't have friends, they have interest. Certainly the United States has an interest in keeping the Iranians out of other countries in the Middle East. The Iranians could legitimately say, of course, that they don't like the United States being in the Middle East, but the United States is a great power. Certainly it has concerns about Russian influence and Iranian influence spreading throughout the Middle East, particularly when viewed from the perspective of the words that the Iranian leadership itself says. When the Iranians chant at many of their leadership meetings and councils, "Death to America," that certainly is something that no American president, no American government could frankly ignore.
All right, so then Farhang, if we back then for a moment to both of these countries' role in Iraq, do you think that the Iranians possibly have stepped too far? Do you think that their involvement in Iraqi politics is simply too much?
Well, obviously, absolutely. I'm not either a supporter or a defender of the Iranian government, but I like, as a scholar, to be fair and to look at the issues in a balanced way. Yep. American involvement in Iraq did not start just with the toppling of Saddam Hussein. They supported Saddam Hussein against the coup which he led against Qasem. It was his man. He went to Egypt. He was protected by the American embassy during the Iran-Iraq war, which they instigated. They helped him to the hilt. He used chemical weapons against Iran and against his own people. About 1 million between the two sides were killed. So they were the supporters of him. Then when he turned against him, they imposed sanctions, which killed at least 500,000 Iraqi children. And then, of course, there was the no-fly zone and various attacks on Iraq, which culminated in 2003 invasion. So to say that Americans have good intentions or are friends of the Iraqis really can't be further from the truth. They have had a terrible record in Iraq. And what are they doing? Iraqis are saying that they have not given permission for Americans to set up bases in Iraq. They are now calling that U.S. forces should leave. Of course, there have been demonstrations, and the attack on the U.S. embassy has to be condemned. And as you know, it has been stopped, but now they are saying that they should put pressure on the Iraqi parliament to call for American forces to withdraw. And I think that is the right way. America really has had a terrible record, not only in Iraq, but in Libya, in Syria, in the Persian Gulf, all over the place in the Middle East for the past few decades. They have left nothing but death and destruction. And I think it's time for them to allow the regional countries to take hold of their own destinies and arrange their affairs.
All right, I'm going to say thank you to Farhang and Frank for their time and, of course, their insight. I'm going to add two new voices to this conversation to keep it going. We're now joined by Zeidon Al-Kinani, who is a political analyst and writer. He specializes in geopolitics and identity politics with a primary focus on Iraq and the Middle East. He's joining us now from Doha. Joining us from Tehran is Seyed Mohammad Hossein Malaek, who is a former Iranian ambassador to China. Seyed Mohammad and Zeidon, thank you both for your time today. Seyed Mohammad, if I may, I'd like to start with you. What do you think the Iranian role has been in these latest protests, especially at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq?
Well, I think the recent events in Iraq, which has been a chain of events, the last episode of the chain of events from last 3 months has ended up with the attack to the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, which now is culminated in all the news that it is and shows that it is a new development in Iraq with relation to Iran. As a matter of fact, this would not been happened if there was not attack to the 5 posts of Hashd al-Shaabi in Iraq, which they were very close to Syrian border rather than to the inside Iraq. And as a matter, another factor which was not clear, or it has not been clear yet, is that we don't know who has been killed in the U.S. Base in northern Iraq, or or how many casualties were there. Who are these people are? Because none of the evidence shows that there is a name or certain people have been killed or injured in that area. So, from the Iranian perspective, they believe that this has been an attack according to the Israeli wishes, which is because the posts which has been attacked are in Abu Kamal and in Qa'im border area, which it has been a target for the Israelis to attack.
All right, so let me bring in Zeidon as well. Zeidon, what are your thoughts on that? There's talk, of course, of the proxy war playing out on Iraqi territory, essentially between the United States and Iran.
Yes, of course. Just the response to the former ambassador, the Iranian government is not worried about any attacks towards the Iraqi leadership or the Iraqi government. In fact, the Iranian government controls the entire Iraqi government. Therefore, any attacks towards the Iraqi government is an attack to the Iranian government, whether it be the PMF forces that are pro-Iran militias or whether it be the Iraqi airbase in Kirkuk. It was triggered by the attack that happened in Kirkuk, and if we look at the gradual order of the events, this is a back and forth game between the US and Iran, and this just shows us the common interest or the common factor between both the US and Iran is that they're trying to distract the attention away from the Iraqi uprising that happened for the past 3 months. This is a way to create a discourse amongst the Iraqi society that the very same militias that have been attacking you in Tahrir Square are now defending your sovereignty against the US aggressor, as if that US aggressor hadn't been existing or playing around or interfering and meddling in Iraqi domestic affairs since 2003. So this is clearly orchestrated by Iran to pull the attention away from the uprising that has been heavily dependent on an anti-Iran sentiment, because people in Iraq are realizing and approaching the Iranian interference in Iraqi domestic affairs and realizing that the corruption and the sectarian regime in Iraq is controlled and powered and supported by Iran, including other neighboring countries and including the US itself, which established that ethnic sectarian quota. So for Iran, this has nothing to do with the interest of Iraq. Iraq is just a playground and a battlefield between the interests of US and Iran. Both are clearly going to show off their military muscles and try to prove to one another that they are more in control in Iraq. However, strategically speaking, Iran might not. I don't think Iran would continue a direct confrontation with the US in the longer term if they realize that this orchestrated plot against the U.S. embassy did not do his job in covering up for or pulling the attention away from the Iraqi uprising. Which
we're quickly running out of time, Zeidon. I apologize. I just want to get both of your final thoughts before I go. Seyed Mohammad, I wanted you to respond to that. Do you think that when the protesters in Iraq say they want all foreign interference out, that should include Iran as well?
What I heard about this last remark, it is an extreme radical view or to describe the Iranian influence in Iraq. That Iran is orchestrating everything, Iran is doing everything, Iran is implementing a government, all the cabinet, and everything. This is a very radical view. I think there are very few people share this idea with our colleagues in this matter. Iran has the influence in Iraq. Iran has supported Iraq against Daesh. Iran is supporting Syria against any internal turbulence against the central government. Iran has been helping the central government of Iraq, has never been an impediment with regard to the government of Iraq's decision on anything. Many of those who are using, if Iran is a main influencer in Iraq, those who are using the possibilities of Iraq is Turkey, is United States, is China, it's not Iran. So Iran is just...
okay, Seyed Mohammad, I'm going to interrupt you. I apologize. I just want to give Zeidon, if you can do this for a minute, I'd really appreciate it. I just wanted you to respond to that. And the same question that I put to Seyed Mohammad there, when protesters say all foreigners out, do you agree that should also then include, of course, the likes of the United States, which, if we're completely honest with ourselves, does have significant, presence within Iraq still?
The United States and Iran are the most prominent regional, the most prominent players that have interfered in post-2003 Iraq. The ethnic sectarian quota in 2003 was established by a U.S. occupier, and it was meddled through an Iranian regime. The former ambassador mentioned that Iran helped Iraq against its fight against ISIS. It did not help Iraq in its fight against ISIS because it was trying to protect Iraq. It was helping Iraq in its fight against ISIS because it had to protect its own interests in Iraq. Iraq is the major station and hub for the Iranian regional influence. If Iran loses Iraq, all of its arms will be cut towards Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Of course, they were going to defend the Iraqi government against ISIS. They didn't defend Iraq because they were defending the Iraqi nation. The rivalry between the Iranian government and the Iraqi government is very clear, and it's very old.
I appreciate you making it very short. I do apologize. We'll try to, of course, have you both back on to continue this discussion. I know that there are a lot of areas we left out, but as I said, I appreciate your time and, of course, your insight on this issue. Viewers, there we spoke to 4 guests, each of them bringing their own points of view on this really complex issue of how this possible proxy war, I mean, you can disagree or agree on that term being used here, of Iran versus the United States playing out on Iraqi territory. Some may say that it's more the U.S. fault, really, that the Americans brought it onto themselves, this latest attack, if that can even be termed as an attack on their embassy there in Baghdad. Others would say it's the Iranians who are encouraging this sort of violence towards American interests in Iraq. But at the end of the day, it's really the Americans who came in and set up the system to begin with. If we're looking at the macro issue, really, of how Iraqi politics is playing out at the moment, what then of those legitimate protests on the streets throughout Iraq as well, about those legitimate grievances that many people have, be it around corruption, be it around bad governance of all sorts? What of these 2 countries who are battling it out in another country, should they step back, as Iraqis are demanding, both of them? They want them out to be able to deal with their own issues. Will the world finally let Iraq set up a system which works for its people, and secondly, leave it to its own will? We'll, of course, keep a close eye on how all that develops there in Iraq. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss North Korea. And as you well know, Kim Jong-un has warned that he will be revealing a new strategic weapon in the near future in the face, of course, of what he said gangster-like U.S. sanctions and pressure. What does this mean for Donald Trump's overtures to North Korea? Has all of that just gone to naught? And has all of that failed? Because Donald Trump certainly needs some sort of a foreign policy win, and seemingly he had bet on North Korea being one of those wins. Has he completely failed in that regard, or will this be able to restart again? Let's firstly introduce our guests right now. We're joined by Tereza Novotna, who is Senior Associate Research Fellow at European, which is a Prague-based think tank, and Mary Skroladska-Curie Fellow at Free University Berlin. She's joining us from Berlin itself. And joining us from Yangon, Myanmar, is Yoichiro Sato, who is a professor at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific Studies University. He's also formerly a security studies instructor at the U.S. Department of Defense Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. He's originally based in Beppu, Japan, but is currently traveling. Yoichiro and Tereza, thank you both for your time today. Tereza, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of North Korea's leader warning about a new strategic weapon, about gangster-like U.S. sanctions? That sort of rhetoric is not new, I imagine.
Hello, and still Happy New Year to everyone. Yes, you are right that to some extent it feels a little bit like return to, let's say, the 2017-18 rhetoric of the so-called Byung-jin line, which means simultaneous development of nuclear and other defense capabilities and economic development. But at the same time, I would say there's been lots of talk about Kim Jong-un withdrawing or receding from the moratorium on missile testing. But I wouldn't see it as clear-cut because all the statements from the party plenum, which we've seen, or the reports from the party plenum, which we've seen, they talk in sort of a bit more ambiguous terms, saying unless the hostilities or the hostile policy from the United States changes, then we will proceed. So it's not as clear-cut as we've been hearing in lots of the media.
All right, so Yoichiro, what is your of this situation? Do you think that there's still very much a chance that Donald Trump may win when it comes to his overtures to North Korea, that this may very well at some point result in denuclearization, or at the very least this moratorium holding?
I'm not sure if there is a winner as such in such a negotiation. But in the short term, I think it's clear that Kim Jong-un blinked first. The North Koreans set the December deadline by themselves, and after the failed summit meeting in Singapore and Hanoi. And now the U.S. has not set any deadline, and the U.S. kept saying it's willing to negotiate. But meanwhile, the U.S. did not pay particular attention to this end of December deadline. And now North Korea is coming forward to get the U.S. attention. So in that sense, the Trump's tactic is working to a degree.
That's interesting you say that, Yoichiro, because this is a danger, though, isn't it? This is a risky game, certainly. Do you not think that there is a chance that this could all really just blow up in Trump's face?
Well, the risk has been that by giving more time, North Korea can upgrade their nuclear and missile capabilities, and they have been testing some newer types of short-range missiles, meanwhile, which Trump tactically decided to downplay. And for allies like Japan, this short-range missile is adding a new degree of threat perception. So it has a lot of implications. But meanwhile, ignoring the deadline is a necessary approach in order to keep this negotiation option some more time, because otherwise, what other options?
All right, so Tereza, this is essentially just grandstanding then, right, on North Korea to an extent. This is a negotiation tactic. Tell us, what do you think the Europeans may be thinking about all this? I mean, I imagine that they've viewed this entire way of how Trump has approached North Korea with a bit of alarm.
Right, indeed. So the Europeans so far haven't really pursued a very clear, unified position, because you have the member states who are in the UN Security Council, primarily France, UK, and also these days Germany, which is a non-permanent member, and they've been more or less trying to go along the line of making statements at the margins of UN Security Council meetings and sort of trying to ramp up the pressure. But on the other hand, of course, you also have European states like Sweden, which has been trying very hard to help the negotiations going. Last time hosting basically the last working level talks with US Special Representative Stephen Biegun in Stockholm in October, which failed. So in Europe, you have kind of a range of views. I would personally try to encourage the European Union as such, not just the member states, to try to put together a formal position and kind of update its old strategy, which is called critical engagement, because at the moment you've seen much more of the critical side of things and much less of the engagement side of things. And Europeans could play much more important role as sort of facilitators, as sort of middlemen, because this is what South Korea tried to do and that didn't work. So there should definitely be space for Europe. But so far Europe hasn't done much in that respect. And I would encourage the new European leadership, especially the new High Representative for Foreign Policy, so sort of like an EU foreign minister who's been in the office since 1st December, to do much more.
Yoichiro, I wonder what your thoughts are about the humanitarian crisis that continues to play out really within North Korea. You know, there's always reports coming out of how, food is scarce and, crops are now an issue, that this year there weren't very good crops, and that will, of course, affect next year. And what kind of pressure do you think that puts on Kim Jong-un in these negotiations with America?
I don't have access to highly classified information about North Korea's domestic economic conditions, and I do think that whatever information available is of highly suspect because of various political considerations, not only North Korea's interests, but also various NGOs who are oftentimes sources of such information have their own agenda. So I cannot comment particularly on that point.
Sure, that's fair enough.
Having said that, however,
Yep, go ahead.
I think is in a difficult fix right now. The announcement itself came in this party congress, and the party congress schedule has been actually extended by 1 day, and it's a clear indication that the meeting specifically accommodated Kim Jong-un's speech. So it shows how significant domestically giving this speech was.
Indeed.
And why?
Okay, well, Yoichiro, I apologize for interrupting you. We'll have to leave there as our final point. Gotten the best of us, but of course, we appreciate both Yoichiro and Tereza for their time today, and of course, for discussing this issue of the the tensions that continue on the Korean Peninsula, specifically when it comes to North Korea, its continuing weapons tests. There was a moratorium, of course, on that that had been agreed upon between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. Kim Jong-un now saying that moratorium will be lifted. Is this a sign that those talks have failed, or is this just a negotiating position again? Is this a tactic on the part of the North Korean leader to try to get more out of the United States, especially considering there have been a number of failed summits as well? even though the photo ops have been all nice and friendly. We'll keep a close eye on that because, of course, the potential for this to get out of hand still very much exists because North Korea is unpredictable, and of course, so is Donald Trump, the U.S. president. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a statement that came out during a meeting that the Iranian foreign minister had with Chinese officials in China itself. China has spoken about the bullying practices of the United States, to be specific, against Iran, and that, of course, in the context of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, which the U.S. and specifically under Donald Trump walked away from. This also comes within the context of recent drills amongst the navies of Russia, China, and Iran, I should say, that have taken place for the first time ever. What is the message that is being sent to the U.S. at this time? Is it that the U.S. is ever more isolated and that these powers, quote unquote, are rising to counter it in some fashion? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Katsiaryna Shmatsina, who is an analyst at the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies. She's joining us now from Minsk in Belarus. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. And joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran, is Mohammad Soltaninejad, who is an assistant professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Tehran. Mohammad, Michael, and Kat, thank you to all three of you for joining us. Kat, let me start with you. What do you make of these drills that were recently held between Russia, China, and Iran? How significant is it that these countries essentially came together to hold these first ever drills? Is it a message, do you think, to the Americans?
I would approach this from this ancient proverb viewpoint that says that an enemy of my enemy is my friend, sort of, and look at from the perspective how China, Russia, and Iran aligned together to rebalance U.S. and U.S. presence in the Middle East and to send a signal that they are conducting those drills and aligning together against the Washington presence in the Middle East.
Michael, certainly if we look at all three of these countries, be it Russia, China, or Iran, all three of them are under pressure right now from the United States. Is this sort of a natural response that they would unite in the face of such pressure?
I think that all three of those countries, Iran, China, and Russia, are geopolitical adversaries of the United States. Now, we have good relationships with China on trade, even though we're in the midst of a trade war. We've apparently just come to an agreement. We want to get along with all three countries, but as far as the worldwide view is concerned, we have widely divergent views from those three countries. And so, as Kat said, I couldn't have put it any better. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It makes sense for China and Russia and Iran to bond together, at least symbolically, but I think this goes further than symbolically, to give a demonstration, a visible demonstration that they will oppose the United States and its international objectives on the world stage. The drills themselves were not that significant. In fact, militarily, they were rather insignificant. The significant part was that they agreed to all band together and to do it visibly and to send a message to the United States. It remains to be seen how much these countries have in common with each other as we move forward. But I suspect that this will be at least a minimally enduring relationship because of course, of their position vis-a-vis the United States on the world stage.
Mohammad, tell us about the Iranian point of view. For the Iranians, I would think that these drills were very, very important.
Yes, I do agree. For Iranians, it was very important because the United States wanted to send this message that after this maximum pressure policy applied against Iran, Iran is isolated, and this maximum pressure policy has paid off and is a successful policy. But in the face of the United States pressures, we can see that not only China and Russia are working with Iran in economic realms, but they are also working in Iran in a strategic area. So it is very important because when some countries work together in strategic level and in the security level, it is about high politics, which is actually very important, and it comes in the top priority of the countries when they want to bond together. So I would say that yes, it is very important for Iran. It actually strengthens Iran's vision about the United States' position in the region. It is about strengthening multilateralism internationally. It is about strengthening international norms and principles that are agreed upon by the great powers and also by the rising powers. Iran is a rising power. China is also a rising power. Russia, in a sense, also is a great power, but also it can be regarded as a country that has interest in the Persian Gulf and in the Indian Ocean. So when they work together, they send this signal that the world that the United States is after, and it is also dominated by the United States, is challenged, and the other countries can work together in order to bring more balance to actually international relations. And regionally, it is also very important because it is about the security of the pathways, of the waterways, and also about the security of the Persian Gulf and the Oman Sea. When they work here together, they also say that we are securing this region, and the turmoil that may come from the United States as an interventionist power is undermined by our cooperation. So it is, I think, at the international and regional levels, yes, it is significant for Iran.
Okay, so Kat, let's cooperation then, because for the Iranians, the most important thing that they would want to happen beyond just military drills and otherwise would be for the nuclear deal to survive in some way. Do you think that the Russians and Chinese have the answer? Do they have the power to save this nuclear deal?
I would first bring up the interests other than just geopolitical rationale, why China and Russia increase and enhance ties with Iran. On one hand, China is interested in the crude oil export from Iran, potentially because, well, Chinese economy needs that. And then on the Russia side, Russia has a good nuclear technology that Russia is willing to export. And then that's on the civilian usage program, not the military one. And so Russia's rationale also could be to export those technologies to Iran and enhance this sort of cooperation. And so when we talk about the JCPOA, that's an interesting point to see how recently the MFA of China pointed out that China stands for the international rules-based order, and they criticized explicitly the U.S. position to, again, withdraw from this nuclear deal, saying that China is now stepping up on international stage to upkeep multilateralism, and then they want to rebalance against this unwise sort of U.S. unilateralism approach. And that's quite ironic, I would say, because the U.S. was for a long time the leader in the multilateralism and the creator of the liberal rules-based order, and now we can see this backfiring, at least rhetorically, against Washington.
Michael, tell me what you think the American point of view would be if the Russians and Chinese, and they do, of course, continue to stand by the JCPOA, certainly. Is that a bit of a nuisance, do you think, for America?
I think it rises probably a step and a half above the level of a nuisance. It's, of course, cause for concern. But China and Russia have been playing this game for decades, where they sometimes get along for purposes of positioning themselves against United States interests, and at other times they find that they don't have enough in common to sustain that. But certainly China and Russia both being very supportive of the regime in North Korea, the current situation where they are supportive of the Iranian efforts. They are both supportive of Venezuela's government. So when you look at
but Michael, if I may come in here, just because we're running out of time, I wanted to ask you this in this context, Michael, that the Russians and Chinese would say, listen, we're just trying to save a multilateral deal, which the Americans also signed on to originally.
Yeah. Okay. So, that's nice. And I actually take them at their word on that. I believe they are trying to save that deal. But they have more embedded reasons than just the content of what the JCPOA is. I think that they are, they still have the interest, the combined interest or the coincidental interest of them in being on the opposite side of something the United States is on. As far as the JCPOA itself is concerned, this is a couple of years old now since Donald Trump has pulled the United States out of that deal. Yeah. It was a deal that he campaigned on pulling us out of. It was a deal that he, under American law, could legally pull us out of because President Obama had neglected to send the deal to the Senate for ratification, and he did that because it would not have achieved ratification in the United States Senate. So ultimately, legally, it became a deal only between President Obama's administration and the other parties to the agreement. President Trump has a different view of the world. He did not think that the deal was in the United States' best interests because it didn't cover the global issues, the array of global issues, such as international support of terrorism and other things, the missile program in Iran, et cetera. And so his viewpoint now is, okay, maximum pressure. Let's go back to the table. Let's negotiate something we are all happy with. And it remains to be seen whether or not that strategy is.
I'm just going to come in because we have under a minute left. Mohammad, the final word. Tell us, do you think that Iran can be convinced, even by the Chinese and Russians, to once again negotiate with the United States if that day comes?
Well, I think the first thing that should be proven to Iran is that the United States is consistent. And this is something I think there is a big question about that. The problem is that the United States does not show consistency in its action, its policies during the Donald Trump administration. The United States has signed a deal that was actually, it has some other parties, and it was an international deal. Iran expected that this deal would be respected by the United States, by all parties, not only Iran, Russia, China, and even the Europeans do expect such a behavior from the United States. But because the United States is speaking from the position of power, actually it is imposing its willingness on the other parties to the deal. So I do agree that perhaps within the United States, actually internal politics, there were divisions about this nuclear deal. We also had these divisions inside Iran. Many would reject this deal, but would it be acceptable if Iranian government was changed and all of a sudden the next Iranian government would actually get out of the deal? It wouldn't be acceptable, and nobody would accept that. So I don't think that these questions should be addressed before Iran can return to the negotiation table. Iran should be given guarantees that any deal that may be signed in the future, it is respected and it is in continuation with the more than 10 years of negotiations that took place before.
Okay, we'll leave it there. That is our final word. But if we appreciate Mohammad, Michael, and Kat for their time and, of course, their insight. Viewers, this issue of the Chinese and Russians standing by Iran, it's important mostly really just for the Iranians themselves. The Chinese and Russians may have their own reasons and their own strategic reasons, really, and their own national interests about why they would want to stand by Iran. And Kat and our other guests, articulated those reasons, be it crude oil or otherwise, or just an anti-American stand for the sake of it, possibly, because all three of these countries are under American pressure right now in their own respective ways. But this is certainly, as I said, important for Iran, especially at a time when it is under maximum pressure campaign by the U.S., when it's being told, come back to the negotiation table, let's renegotiate this deal, this hard-fought deal, as Mohammad there just said at the end. Will the Iranians play ball? How important have these drills been, these Navy drills between these three countries? And will China and Russia be able to actually save the JCPOA from completely going down the drain? We'll, of course, keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.